Okay, so we're looking at computers and the hardware. So what is a computer? So it's formed of various pieces of technology connected together using something called a bus we'll look at in a bit. The major pieces we're going to be looking at include the processor, memory, and disks and storage. And we'll be looking at other pieces of computer such as the keyboard, mouse, etc. First of all, we're going to look at computers in general and what are computers and what are embedded devices. So let's look at computers generally. A lot of computers are in devices which you don't really think about as being computers, such as, for example, when you use your washing machine or other equipment in the home. Smart TVs are really computers, games consoles are really computers, and they basically have quite often quite powerful computers built into them, but you don't think of them as computers. What you think of a computer is maybe a laptop or a desktop. Well, they obviously are normal computers, and they're referred to generally as general purpose computers. But you also have quite a lot of embedded devices, a lot of embedded systems, computers in them. So, for example here, a mobile phone is a general purpose device, whereas a coffee maker may have a computer built into it which performs a simple feature. So here's a scene, and this scene has a number of embedded devices. So we've got a coffee maker we talked about already. We've got a vacuum cleaner, a thermostat, security system, Bluetooth speaker, and other devices such as, for example, we've talked about TVs, printer, etc. An early pioneer of computing, a chap called John von Neumann, who died in 1957, actually predicted how modern computers would look. He predicted that a modern computer would have input devices, output devices, and a core component, which you and I will probably call the actual computer, which would have both a processor and memory. And he also predicted that memory would hold both instructions and data. So before then, most people believed that future computers would have separate memory for instructions to separate memory for holding the data. So here's an example of a motherboard. So on this motherboard, you can see that there's a processor which is plugged into here. There's a copy, an example of a processor. Those little dots are actually metal pins. You got memory, which is socketed into these slots here. Hard drives, which connect via a special cable into this little area here. And externally, you've got devices such as input and output devices, which normally plug in through USB, for example, or through special plugs. So let's look at the actual processor itself in a little bit more detail. So the main processor has millions or even billions of transistors, and it's very often thought of as the brains of the computer. It performs all the calculations, and it does things like logical decision making, and it actually executes computer programs. And it comprises of a number of special areas. So it comprises initially of what's called a control unit, which is it basically acts like some sort of traffic warden in the middle of the road. And as things enter into the processor, it decides what to do with them. You've also got an ALU, which is an arithmetic and logic unit. This is the main core and takes up most of the space in the processor, where it actually does all the calculations and it does all the various decision making as well as executing programs. You got special type of memory in the processor. and you got two types of memory. You got general memory, which is just used for storing programs. So when a program needs to be executed, it needs to be loaded into the computer processor, and it probably needs to take a couple of parts separately into the processor. So to be able to compile it back to a single program inside the processor, each part needs to be stored separately in the register. And once all the parts are together, it will then execute that particular program. So general purpose register is used for doing that. But there's also some special registers which have special features. There's registers which know the location of the program we're loading so it doesn't lose track. There's a register which records the location of the computer mouse. So when the actual mouse is clicked, it knows already the location where the mouse is. And that is an automatic process within the computer which keeps track of where your mouse is at all times. And it's also got an internal bus so that information and data can travel within the processor very quickly using this internal bus. And we'll talk a bit more about buses in a minute. And all of this, it takes place using what's known as the fetch execute cycle. It's a continuous, never stopping cycle, constantly happening as the computer performs its tasks. So here's an example of a fetch execute cycle. And this requires two components. It requires the processor and the memory. So the memory can hold all the programs, and the processor does all the actual calculations, decision making, and executes the actual programs themselves. So the first part is to fetch the instruction. So the computer fetches the next instruction. The control unit in the second stage decodes that and figures out what it is. If it's a first of, say, a new program to be run and executed, it may store it in memory and wait for the next parts to arrive, and then once it's all available, then it will execute the actual piece of code. Whichever situation arises, at some point it will then need to go into the execution stage. So it executes the code, it does the calculations depending on what needs to be done. And then, depending on if there's a result, it puts that result back into main memory, and it will then carry on with the next task. So it will be, while it's executing the previous task, it will actually be loading the next task into the processor. So it's continuously fetching and executing instructions one after the other. And that's what the computer does. It's constantly getting instruction after instruction and follow instructions one after the other. Of course, it's doing it very fast. All of this was predicted by John von Neumann. Now, the memory we have in modern computers, although it's getting faster, and it's also becoming extremely cheap in comparison to previous forms of memory, but the memory we use these days is still based on the original memory even early computers used to use. It's a form of volatile memory, which means basically as soon as you turn the power off, you lose the contents of that memory, which is fine so long as you obviously have the power on. And that means, therefore, we need some other form of memory, which we'll talk about in the form of hard drive space and storage in a minute. So simple memory is called random access memory. So random access memory is the type of memory which is used for day-to-day. And you normally on a computer have quite a lot of it. A modern computer could have maybe 16 gigabytes of random access memory, which in historic terms is a huge amount. But there is also another type of memory. Most people don't really ever think about this type of memory. It's called read-only memory. It's absolutely tiny amounts of memory, and it performs a very simple job of loading the operating system into the computer when power is first turned on. So think about it. When you have a new computer, or you take a computer which you turned off the night before, whenever you turn the power back on, you need something which is not in volatile memory, which has been lost. You actually need something which is always available, which can spring into action and perform a very simple task. The task of start reading this operating system and executing it. And that's what read-only memory does. It does a few other little jobs. For example, it keeps the clock accurate and what have you, but that's its main job. So the contents of main memory looks like that, similar to what we've looked at. They're normally in strips. You may be looking at some in the classroom when we have the session. So but it's volatile memory. It's used for doing day-to-day tasks, for holding programs, for holding the data. So when you're doing video editing, it might be holding the various video files and such like in main memory. It's reasonably fast. It's close to the processor, so it loads into the processor quite quickly. But there's also this other very old-fashioned memory, this read-only memory, which you may see on the motherboard with a little special copyright label. And this memory, as I say, it's very old technology, but its main task is to actually start the operating system loading into the processor when power is restarted, as well as a few other jobs we'll look at in a sec. So let's just recap and look at, you've got different types of memory so far. We've got registers, which are within the actual processor itself, which is extremely fast, possibly as fast as the processor itself. It's very small capacity, extremely small capacity. You're talking about possibly kilobytes or maybe a megabyte at most. And it's extremely expensive, and it is definitely very volatile. As soon as the power's turned off, it's gone as well. Likewise with random access memory, which is very fast, not as fast as the memory inside the processor, of course. And you tend to have, a moderate amount of this. It's getting cheaper by the moment, it's cheaper all the time, and it's still volatile. And then we need another type of memory, a memory which is non-volatile, a memory which, when you tell the computer to turn off, you can copy all the files and what have you onto that type of memory for next time you turn the computer on. And that's what we call storage, or what you might think of as a hard drive. So we've got hard drives which are speed-wise quite moderate. It's much slower than memory, but they do a different job to memory. They're backup storage. Capacity-wise, normally much higher than memory. You can have terabytes of memory for quite cheap. So very, very cheap, but they're non-volatile. You can keep things on there forever. Let's look at the processor again in a little bit more detail. So there's a standard sort of modern desktop processor. The i-series of processors are probably the dominant, if not the main type of processor for modern computers. Here's an example of a very, very early processor, a time-lapse image of how it's processed. You can see that there's a large area down here, which is the ALU. And the ALU has a large area predefined functions built into it, already developed from its from its manufacturing. So there'll be areas for doing addition, another area for doing subtraction, another area for doing multiplication, and so on and so on. Then you've also got a large area of what we probably refer to as registers, memory, internal memory. And that internal memory is basically recording, saving things to and from. And then we got a control area. And the control area simply organizes what's taking place and where it's taking place and what task needs to be performed next. Very similar, as I say, to the analogy of some sort of, traffic cop in the middle of the road, directing everything. Most of what happens requires data and information to be transmitted from one device to another device, both internally in the processor, but also around the motherboard. And that's what we call a bus. That's the task of a bus. The bus is basically a circular motorway going around devices such as motherboards, and it communicates messages, sometimes in multiple parts. So when you have, for example, a video file, that'll have to be transmitted possibly in 100 individual parts. And when they arrive, they get recompiled into a single file. And that's what the job of the bus is. It's transmit information from place to place. So the bus transmits, just like, for example, from your computer, you'd send down a wire to a video screen, the image, which then gets displayed. Well, it's the same process, but happening constantly within a device such as a computer. Okay, and buses normally are in a sequence of small cables, as you can see them on the actual image on the hard drive. The reason for this is because computers use a method of communication called binary. And binary is a series of zeros and ones, a bit being either a zero for no electricity on that particular wire, or one which has a small amount of electricity on that wire. And that's how information is communicated electronically throughout the motherboard. Now, most modern computers are 64 bits, so you need at least 64 individual wires to transmit at once. So that's why you have so many of these individual lines on your motherboard. Older PCs were 32 bits, and before that, really old PCs were 16-bit, but not for many decades. Now, all of this is impossible unless everything communicates at a standard rhythm, a beat. And this is provided by one of the smallest, but yet one of the probably most important devices on your motherboard, the clock. The clock is basically a tiny piece of quartz crystal, and electricity is fed into that quartz crystal, and when it comes out the other side, it pulses at an exact rate. So that rate is exactly the same with all quartz, no matter where the quartz was mined, and that then is used to provide the time for all calculations, for communication through the computer right out into the internet. And that is controlled by this read-only memory we talked about before. It's the same chip which performs not only the task of starting the operating system to be loaded into the computer, but also deals with some simple but essential household tasks, such as keeping the clock going and making sure that the clock is correct. Okay, so let's look at storage. So hard drives originally used to be spinning disks with a read-write head which moved from side to side. So the hard drive itself here would have been, virtually split into a number of tracks, possibly hundreds of tracks going across that disk. And the read-write head on both the top and the bottom of the disk would be bolted together, so they moved together at the same time. And at the very end of that read-write head, there's a tiny magnetic reader which can both read information which has been stored previously on the disk, as well as it can magnetically write new information to a location on the disk. And as the disk spins, it knows its exact location. So in that case, it will be able to figure out exactly, where information was written to, and reread this later on from exact location. So that whole piece of disk would be like a huge piece of paper taking up a piece of wall with individual boxes numbered, and it could reread and write into individual locations. Now, about a decade ago, computer manufacturers realized with new modern memory, we could make a type of memory which, although it wasn't as non-volatile as a hard drive and would last for thousands of years, it could still last for possibly a decade using a specially built-in battery and a very, very low battery usage type of memory. And we created what's called an SSD, a solid state drive. And SSDs have the advantage of not having any moving parts, and nothing ever wears out. And they also indirectly make no noise. If you remember the days of hard drives, when you turn the computer on, you used to get this wind-up noise, which is the actual hard drive spinning up. So SSDs are silent. They also have the advantage of using solid-state memory, which is faster to read and write to than the hard drives wherever. So they actually are faster, they're silent, and they're in some regards starting to become quite cheap. So most computers, especially computers you may buy today, will probably come with a solid state drive rather than an actual magnetic spinny drive, as we often refer to them. The main advantage of storage in the form of a hard drive, of course, is it's non-volatile. You do not lose it. So when you turn the computer off, when you press the power button to turn it off, what it actually does is it transfers all the information it needs for next time onto the hard drive, onto the storage. You can also think of, other forms of non-volatile memory, such as flash drives and CD drives and stuff, as doing a similar task. So now let's just look at other devices which you may be aware of. For example, input and output devices. So von Neumann predicted that we'd have various devices which were used for transmitting information into the computer, such as the keyboard when you type and the mouse. And there's other things you may not use very often, for example, a barcode reader. And also we'd have certain devices for outputting or displaying information or what have you coming from the computer, such as the monitor. You can have headphones for sound or speakers for sound, printers for printing out things. And of course, there are some devices which can both input as well as output. So, for example, a pen drive or a flash drive, you can write to it as well as read from it. Likewise with a CD. And webcams can be written, but you can also use sound. But majority. So digital cameras you can write to as well as read to. But there's examples of input and output devices.